what do we have in common with operations? What do we have in common with the products that have been produced through operations, or with the services that have been delivered through operations? What we have in common with this is life cycles. So we can imagine that as people have a life cycle, starting from their childhood and then the evolution until the adulthood, in eventually the retiring. So the same happens with products. The same happens with services. The same happens with processes as well. And so initially there will be an investment to nurture these new products and to make things clearer and simpler. So we're going to use product as a way to label all the new innovations brought to the market, all the new product development. And so there will be this initial investment leading to the childhood stage, the emerging stage of a new product development, which will eventually develop into a more mature stage. Not always the case, because it could happen, same as it happens to human beings, that something bad will take place along the way. And new products may actually abort or die in the early childhood. And why this is important for operations? It's important for operations because the life cycle will determine the type of processes, the type of business processes which will be used in our operations. Not only this, the life cycle also helps understand better about the operation function, the overall role of the operations. And to an extent, we can also link the life cycle to the operation evolution. So over the past few centuries, we have observed, we have witnessed the evolution of operations and supply chain management, which unleashed many different product life cycles. What we are going to discuss in this lecture then will be the life cycle, how the life cycle matches with processes, how the life cycle determines the right processes. And then we will dig deeper into the function of operations and how the function of operation determines the organogram of the operations, how operations are deeply intertwined with all the other business functions. And finally, we will take a sort of step back to look at the evolution of operations and supply chain management to contextualize the operations in their development. Usually, strategies, corporate strategy, business strategy, operation strategies are tied to the product life cycle, which means that depending on the stage of the product life cycle, we will design a different type of strategy. The strategy, the go-to-market strategy, the operation strategy, which we deploy at the initial stage of the product life cycle, is different from the strategy which we enact when we enter into adulthood stage, or even different from the strategy we use when we are at the end of a product life cycle. There are a few more factors which we need to be very aware of. One is about the length of a product life cycle, and this is a difference with the example I mentioned at the beginning. So with the metaphor I mentioned at the beginning, so whilst the life cycle of human beings is getting longer and longer, leading to super age society, the life cycle of product is getting shorter and shorter. So this is a difference, a stark difference between the life cycle of people and life cycle of products. The consequence, as I mentioned, is we always need to find the right match between the life cycle and the appropriate business strategy. A visualization of a life cycle can plot on the horizontal axis the time of development of a new product, and on the vertical axis, the demand coming from the market. And generally, the life cycle will take this S-shaped visualization, S-shaped matrix with a flat beginning. This is where you try to push for the adoption of a new innovation, then is rapid growth of a product adoption. And this is when products will enter into the adulthood stage, the maturity stage, and then eventually either will, to an extent, reach a plateau, meaning that we are not growing, but we are not declining either, or in some cases, there will be a new S-curve, a new product life cycle beginning, and this will be in synchrony with the discontinuation of existing products. So when the company decides to terminate the production of the existing products to begin the production of a new product. Life cycle is tied to the business strategy, but life cycle is also tied to the processes, the business processes, the operational processes which we adopt in the company. So here you can find how we can combine different business processes with the four prime ages of a life cycle. So the childhood or market entry, the growth stage, the adulthood or maturity, and then old stage, which eventually will lead to the discontinuation of a product. So in terms of processes, generally at the very beginning, this is a sort of like prototype market fit type of stage when you are producing a small batch of products and you are still testing the waters, testing the market. So this is where you generally adopt a job sharp approach. When you start entering into the growth stage, so here you will move into the batch production or decoupled flow because you have an increase in the volume and also an increase in the standardization, which allows you to produce in a batch. You also have a solid market response at this point. And at the same time, there are more competitors that are coming into the space. And when competitors are coming into your market, then you need to increase your quality, you need to increase your reliability, which a decoupled flow will ensure, whilst generally a job shop is so much more flexible, but at the same time does not ensure a solid, robust quality control. When your product will enter into the adulthood stage, so this is when you have a high stable volume, you have a lot of competitors. The product is not innovative, it's not new any longer, which means you are competing mostly on price, and consequently you need to reduce your cost structure, and a fully decoupled flow or an assembly line is the right choice for this moment. The old stage, not all products will enter into the old stage and will be just like discontinued. So, but for the products that enter into the old stage, so this is when product will become a commodity and then eventually replaced by a new one. So here, an appropriate business process that can match the product is the continuous flow. We also need to consider two important differences when we design the business processes based on whether the market need is more for a make-to-order type of production, meaning that your production will start only after you receive an order. Consequence here would be that you have a lower stock, you have a lower work in progress, but at the same time, this leads to a longer lead time. So this is feasible, appropriate for products, services that don't have any problem in terms of stocking, because otherwise, if you have like concern about the stocking, or for example, if your product by being in the stock will depreciate, will lose their value. So in this case, you should prioritize the make-to-order process. Make-to-order process is used in many famous industry, including the automotive industry. This is because, of course, if you have a large stock of cars, and as you know, like the more the cars will be in the stock, the more they will be depreciated. And that's why automakers always trying to reduce as much as possible the stock of cars. Sometimes this is not feasible, and that's why there will be, from time to time, this flooding in the market of cars that have been produced but they haven't been sold. This is a typical case during economic crisis, when consumer will say, I cannot buy the car anymore, and they won't buy the car, and the consequence is there will be a lot of cars that must be sold in a short period of time, because otherwise they will depreciate. The more they wait, the more they will eventually depreciate, even if they're not used. The other scenario is the make-to-stock scenario. So this is when you increase your standardization as much as possible. There is no problem of deterioration or depreciation of the products, even if they are stock. So that's not a concern in this case. In this type of process, we have a shorter lead time. So in some industries, that would be a key advantage. So we have clarified what is the relationship between our product life cycle and different types of business processes. But taking a more holistic perspective, what is the operation function, and how does different life cycles have an impact, have a role on the operation function? To an extent, we can see that operation is the core, the scaffolding of a company business, and will relate with the market function, with finance accounting function, and of course with the production function. So operations, to an extent, are the backbone that enables an organization to function properly. Here you can see a list of operational function that is not exhaustive, but this is a way to have a better grasp of all the functions that operation would fulfill. In here, we can see the relationship of operation with the other departments of a firm. So as you can see, operation will be intertwined with the finance and accounting, will be intertwined with suppliers of a company, with the business development and marketing side, and also with the human resource and talent management. If you don't have this scaffolding provided by your operations, and if you don't have a continuous communication and feedback loop between finance, marketing, human resources, and suppliers in your operations, you will have eventually some conflicts among your business functions. You have some inconsistency in your organization. For example, if you look at the relationship between the operations and the human resources, so the operation will feed the human resources with the skill set needed, and especially when it comes to newer jobs, newer skills, from programming to data science to business analytics and so on. There must be a very strong communication between the talent acquisition and your operations. This is why in technology startups and more innovative firms, we even find people with a technology background or with a good technology understanding being employed in the human resource department. And this is because we need to ensure that the requirements of the operation, which might be very technical, are then passed down into their talent acquisition search. Another consequence of the continuous digitalization of the operation is that this will be reflected in all the other departments of the organization. And to an extent, operation from being the scaffolding will become even more important, because when technology is infused in human resources, in marketing, in the supply chain management, in your finance and accounting, it means that the role of operations is becoming even more crucial than it used to be. In the following slide, I'm giving you some example organizational structure in how the operations in different industries collaborate and contribute to other business departments. So here we see an example of a commercial bank. Here we see an example of an airline. And finally, here there is an example of a manufacturing company. I say that operations are very crucial, and due to technology evolution, are becoming even more crucial. So a sample organizational structure that now many companies are adopting is displayed on this slide. So you see that under the chief executive officer, who will direct the overall strategy of the organization, we have a CFO in charge of accounting and finance. We have a chief information officer and a chief operation officer. And reporting to the chief operating officer, there will be human resources department, will be the operations, will be the supply chain, will be the marketing, the business development, and so on. So this organizational structure is to ensure that there is cohesion and consistency among operations in the other business departments of the organization. This is also a consequence of the continuous development of new products and the shortened life cycle of new products. So with the life cycle of products getting shorter and shorter and shorter, consequently, operation must be more agile, but must be faster. And whenever something will compete on operational excellence, on agility, on fastness, it also requires more focus. It requires more a commitment. And this is one of the reasons why operations are getting a more crucial, more strategic for companies. The last part of this lecture is to take a step back and to understand the evolution of operations. The first point to consider is that operations are a rather recent discipline. So to an extent, until the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the 18th century in the UK, we didn't really have any comprehensive study on operations because we did not have actually operations. We had this sort of like craft production, more like handcrafting, which did not need a study on operations. But with Industrial Revolution, with the first economic studies, so this led to some fundamental concept knowledge that led to the creation of operation, from the division of labor, so specialization of workers in some specific job, to the standardization of the parts used for mass production, to the creation of scientific management. This happened at the beginning of 20th century, especially thanks to an engineer, Taylor, who was the first one to bring scientific methodology into management. And more recently, to this focus on quality quality revolution, which is the consequence of more emphasis on the customer demand. In this is also tied to the shorter product life cycle and an increased need of customization coming from the market. In this last part of operations development, which happened in the last roughly 30 years, we've also seen the adoption of new methodologies, many of them being first invented in Japan, but then have been deployed globally. And this also represented a shift from the US in the first half of the 20th century, where the manufacturing base of the world, and then there was a progressive shift towards other countries, as we're going to see in a moment. The Japanese approach to operation supply chain management also invented the lean production. Lean production essentially means that we adapt the mass production in a way that will prioritize the quality, will prioritize the flexibility to address this shorter life cycle and the higher need of flexibility. Here we can have a chronology of the operations. So as you can see, we start from the Industrial Revolution, then we move on into the scientific approach of operation theater, Gantt, the Gantt, who named the famous Gantt chart, which is still used today. Henry Ford, who was the first one to design an assembly line and higher standardization. A research and operation in the mid of the 20th century. Many of these concepts are still in use today, from the deployment of linear programming into the operation, the PERT, CPM that are used in product management even today. So all of these are concepts that are still usually deployed in every day. And then the role of quality and lean manufacturing, lean model, especially from Japan, which then ended into a higher adoption of information technology, internet into the operations, and the most recent trends in operation, globalization, sustainability, and digital revolution. I'm going to touch on this in a moment, but I wanted to give you an example of a quality revolution from Japan in how these concepts were not just based on the context of Japan, but they could be applied in other contexts as well. For instance, in the 70s and 80s, pressured by the competition from Japan, many manufacturing companies from the US started selling their plants in the US to Japanese company. One of them was a TV manufacturing plant owned by Motorola, which was sold to Matsushita from Japan. And there were some string attached in this deal. And the string attached was that Matsushita could not find any other people in the plant. But in just 2 years' time, by adopting the lean methodology from Japan, Matsushita was able to double the production, cut the assembly repairs, and dramatically increase the quality. And this is when companies globally realized that this approach was the right approach to improve, to reboost their operations. So the most recent trends in operations are related to the globalization. Globalization, to an extent, reshaped operations also in a way that we moved from the traditional approach to operations to the more holistic concept of supply chain management. Sustainability has been incorporated into companies' operation, especially in the past 10 years. and this is in an effort to make operations less energy wasting, so to ensure that operations are not having a major impact on the environment. And finally, the digitization of operation, which consists primarily of a big data revolution, Internet of Things, which is essentially to put on sensors in the operation and to transfer the data to your IT system. This new concept of 3D printing or additive manufacturing, and then how these new technologies can be deployed in different themes like smart cities, autonomous driving, drones, and so on. So it's important to consider that an additional objective that operations are now tasked with is resilience. So the ability to adapt, the ability to bounce back in whenever there is a crisis, which relates to the sustainability, to the digital revolution, and so on. This is the trend of supply chain management with, in a way, the externalization of a transformation process, which does not happen within the company no more, but became more of an external transformation process done by suppliers of the companies and then moving towards the company and finally to dealers of the company. In the globalization trends, which leads us back to the PLC, the product life cycle. One of the key reasons that led to globalization was to diversify product life cycle, because the companies, especially multinational companies, could sell older product life cycle in emerging markets, and this enabled them to jump to the new product life cycle in advanced markets and to optimize the investment and the production costs related to the different product life cycles. So again, here we see the key major role of a product life cycle into operational strategy, operational function, and into shaping the factors that affect operations, such as the role of product life cycle in driving globalization over the past 30 years. Other reasons behind this were to find source of supply, exploit trends, technology, and of course, arbitrage of cost. So find places, geographies where products could be produced at a lower cost. A few examples of the role of globalization. Here you can find a hourly compensation cost. For production workers, data are in US dollars. So as you can see, we have on top like advanced countries in Europe and in the US, advanced Asian economies, and then emerging economies. With labor cost in emerging economies, it is going up progressively. For example, China is moving up rapidly in the labor cost, in most likely in a short period of time. Many companies that decided to base their manufacturing in China due to the arbitrage on cost, the fact that the production cost was lower than in Europe or the US, will relocate in either more cheaper countries, or maybe we reshore, meaning they will bring the production back to either their home country or in nearby countries. For the US, this country might be Mexico, because then the transportation and logistic costs, which are, again, another big chunk of the operation, will be much lower rather than transporting goods from China to the US. Another interesting trend, which we can see from the increased role of globalization, is the GDP, different GDP of countries, with a GDP of China overall GDP overtaking the US. Here you can find data that are based from 2018. So China being the first, second, America, India, Japan, and so on. And another important figure to analyze is the percentage of goods that are exported. So on this metric, on this chart, we can find figures from manufacturing countries, and we see that are some countries, for example, Germany and Mexico. So these countries are exporting the majority of their products or services. When we talk about exports, we include both. So we include both products and services. Germany, let me give you a figure, export 87% of goods or services that are produced in Germany. Then there are other countries, such as the US, where the production is mostly aimed at the local domestic market. Then we have countries like China, India, where we are progressively shifting from being exporting countries to be more focused towards the domestic market. China, 38% of the goods are exported. For India, this is a slightly higher, is 41%. And then the final chart for today's video. So this is about the manufacturing output, the overall manufacturing output. So as we can see, in between 2009 to 2010, we have seen China surpassing the US as the biggest manufacturing country. At the peak in 2014, the manufacturing output of China reached 24% of global manufacturing output. And a consequence of this is that now we see also companies that used to receive orders from US, from Japan, from Europe, and produce them in China, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and so on. Now, these companies, such as Foxconn, Foxconn is a large Taiwanese, very large Taiwanese corporate with production sites for many of IT companies, from Apple to Dell to Motorola to Sony and so on. So companies like Foxconn that originally were heavily based for their manufacturing in China only, now we are moving to other countries as well. So we are establishing new manufacturing sites. In Mexico, very recent news is that Foxconn invested for a new plant in Arizona because the US would like to relocate the production of semiconductors, which are very critical component behind almost every new digital technology. So the US implemented a policy to relocate the production of semiconductors in the US. And at the same time, on the other hand, China is pushing for higher knowledge in the production of semiconductors, because it is true that China has been producing them for a long period of time, but China lacks the capability in R&D and engineering related to semiconductors. And so now China is stepping up to enhance their capabilities in R&D and engineering for the manufacturing of semiconductors. So what we have seen in this lecture was, first, the role of a product life cycle in different strategy and processes based on the product life cycle, how the product life cycle can relate to the operational function, and finally, the factors reshaping operations and supply chain management, one of them being the product life cycle, and specifically the customization in the shorter product life cycle, which are driven by market demand. Thank you for watching.